Hey everybody, it's Matt. This is the 10-minute Bible Hour, and you all remember Julius Caesar, right? Like he's maybe top 5, top 10 most famous people in history. And there's all kinds of legends and myths and movie and TV portrayals surrounding the guy, and so it's easy to have it all lumped together a little bit. But one of the most famousest of all of the Julius Caesar anecdotes is the moment in 49 BC when he took his 13th Legion and crossed the Rubicon River. I mean, we got a Jeep named after it. It's such a famous thing. And in that moment, what had happened was that the Senate, which was still the ruling body in Rome at that point, a lot of people are like, oh, Julius Caesar, the Roman Empire, those two things did not overlap. Caesar was not a Roman emperor at any point. He was a part of the Republic. And so the Senate was the real source of power there, or at least they thought. It turned out that a powerful military leader with a charismatic personality and a whole bunch of legions under his command, that was the guy who was actually in charge. But the Senate, they overestimated their popularity and authority, and they thought Caesar was getting a little uppity, and so they sent a message to him up north and said, hey, you need to drop all of your titles, you need to drop all of your legions off, you need to come down as a normal citizen. We have something we just wanted to talk to you about without your armies there. So if you could just swing by without them, that'd be super. Well, Caesar, who was smart enough to conquer most of Europe, was also smart enough to be like, I see what you're doing. Do you want my army to go away so that you can charge me with some dumb trumped up thing and kill me because you view me as a threat to your authority because of how much people like me and how much armies like me, so I'm probably not going to do that. So he goes to his legions and gives a speech in Rimini, I think. And in this speech, he says more or less like, hey, come with me. We got to go and sort out this infestation that exists in Rome. And for whatever reason, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm sure it's Googleable, but for whatever reason, he only takes one legion. And he crosses the Rubicon. Apocryphally, it is credited to him that he says the die is cast as he does so. And he marches on Rome. Pompey, who you've heard of, and a bunch of his cronies in the Senate, they grab what legions and what stuff they can. They're like, we cannot defend Rome. And they go off and flee. And eventually Caesar defeats them all in a big Roman civil war that paves the way toward the end of the Republic and the beginning of the empire. But what's interesting for our purposes right here is what Caesar did when he showed up in Rome. He was not greeted with trepidation or horror or, oh, who's this invader? People were happy to see him. Everybody had Caesar fever. And then he rolled into town, and what did he do? He went right to the place where authority happens, the Curia, the Senate building, and started issuing pardons and straightened out the political mess that was going on there very quickly, very decisively, very authoritatively, and everybody dug it. And it only made sense that he would walk in the door, be well received, and then go straight to this building that is representative of the authority, the consolidation of power in the minds of that Roman populace, that Roman audience. Well, likewise, in Matthew chapter 21, we have Jesus of Nazareth rolling into Jerusalem, being hailed as a king, being hailed as the descendant of David, the son of David. And everybody knows that Hosanna, son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. All of these references are the kind of thing that you don't just yell at somebody who just won a soccer match or a wrestling match or something. This is much bigger. This is gigantic. This is the kind of thing that changes politics and religion and the world. If this guy is indeed the son of David, that's a very loaded concept in the first century AD. And so as we were reading the other day, Jesus comes into town and he does, well, the same thing Caesar does. He goes right to the place where the authority happens. He doesn't skulk around in the alleys or go to check in with his buddies first or consolidate power. He rolls into town like he owns the place, though very modestly, considering he came in on a donkey, and he goes right to the place where authority happens, and he starts solving the things and addressing the things that need to be addressed. Now, in this case, what he felt needed to be addressed on the surface level looks like a justice issue. You got this religion that's existed for thousands of years and existed in this form with a ton of structure for 1,400 years by this point when Jesus shows up. And there are these old allowances for pilgrims to come and make sacrifices at the temple. You can't do all the sacrifices just wherever you want. The religious consensus is you got to go to Jerusalem. You got to sacrifice at the temple because God lives in the temple, and this is where you do it. And this is where the religious oversight that's necessary to get your sacrifices right occurs. And so good Jews in the first century, including Jesus' family, they made this trip, would go down, and when they were in town, they would use their money, whether it was a local currency, in which case it was really easy to use their money because they could just walk up to a vendor and buy the appropriate animal for sacrifice, depending on their income bracket, or if they were traveling from a bit further away and maybe they were trading with currencies from up north, like the old Tyrian shekel that we've talked about at other times, or maybe they're using some sort of Roman currency or other local currency, whatever the case, it's going to have to be translated into some common unit of measurement so that that principle from Leviticus 14, where you talk about sacrificing a couple of doves or pigeons instead of something more elaborate based on need, so that all of that is going to add up the right way for religious and economic purposes. So we got two different types of business going on here. One is the actual selling of the sacrificial animals, and the other is the money changing. But it gets interesting when we go and compare the actual accounts as to trying to figure out which group he had the gripe with. And it looks like both. Matthew gives us a great take on that. The passage we're talking about today, Matthew 21, starting in verse 12, it says, Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there. So that's not money changing. That's the animal trade. He overturned the tables of the money changers. Okay, so there's the second party, and the benches of those selling doves. All right, so it looks like it is both. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. And then over in Mark 10, no, hang on, 11, we get the triumphal entry. And then on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and wouldn't allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. And then he said, it's written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it into a den of robbers. And then over in Luke, again, don't know exactly where, and I'm finding it, getting closer, 19, end of 19, it says, verse 45, then he entered the temple area and began driving out those who were selling. It's written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of robbers. So we don't really get a lot of specifics about money changers in Luke 19, but if you add the whole thing up, it looks like his complaint was with this whole system, this whole mess. Maybe that it was happening within the boundaries of the temple, maybe something more. The account in John is an interesting contrast because John positions this purging of the temple marketplace at the beginning of Jesus' ministry in chapter 2, right after the wedding at Cana. He goes back down to Capernaum and then on to Jerusalem for the Passover. And verse 13, it says, when it was almost time, Jesus went to the temple. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So I like this part. So he made a whip out of cords and drove them all from the temple area. So it looks like maybe there are actually two incidents where Jesus did this, and because of the synoptic gospels place the majority of Jesus' story up north, and because John has Jesus going back and forth between the north and the south a little bit more, John gives us this early event. The synoptic gospels all agree that there was also a later event, but I like in this early event how Jesus thinks about it for a while. He's like, no, this really is a problem. I don't want it to look like this was just spontaneous and I just lost my temper. I'm going to go and take a few minutes to fashion a whip so that they know I really, really, really meant it. And then he goes and does what he does. And the emphasis here on this cleansing of the temple is a little bit different. He says, get these out of here. How dare you turn my father's house into a market? So while the Julius Caesar stuff at the beginning, well, this is what I'm driving at. It was viewed by the original audience in Rome as entirely Julius Caesar's not just right, but duty and obligation to come into town and sort things out. Things had turned sour and foul, and if anybody was going to be the reformer who had the authority to speak to the situation, it was going to be Julius Caesar. So he walks into town, he goes straight there, he does his thing. Likewise here, the expectation would be that the Son of David would have the authority to do this. He should go straight to the temple. If things are amiss there, and Jesus has been teaching in so many words that things were really amiss there, he used very harsh language to describe the whole racket that was being run religiously at the time. If that's the case, and he said all that stuff, and he is the Son of David, then he is not just entitled to do this, but it is his duty, his obligation to be the one who goes and sorts this stuff out. The sum total of Matthew, Mark, and Luke's accounts make it clear that the whole racket was a problem for him. It wasn't just the money changers. It wasn't just the selling of things. The whole thing is a giant sham, and he uses the same phrase in all of them. You're turning this place into a den of robbers. In the first purging of the temple of account in John, Jesus' remarks make it look like where this stuff is occurring is also part of the complaint, that this marketplace maybe would be okay if it weren't happening right here. Again, you got to read between the lines a little bit to figure out exactly what's going on. It's not hard to go back and do the math on the political unfolding of the first half of the first century BC to understand why people in Rome lost their sense of respect or confidence in the Senate, and why a popular military leader like Caesar could rise to power, and why people would ascribe to him these attributes and this role of the cleanser of Rome. But with Jesus, it's a little bit further look back. This wasn't the kind of thing that just cropped up in the last few decades before he shows up in Jerusalem as a recent innovation in terms of political philosophy or religious ideology. This is a very old idea that is attached to all of the law and the prophets and the stories of the Old Testament, and even to the Old Testament motif of the cleansing of the temple from time to time. And next time around, we're going to take a look at what connections the original audience might have been making and why they viewed Jesus as within his rights, even following through on his duties in how he responded to this whole thing. Thanks to everybody who supports the program at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. A few of you just jumped in here this last week at the beginning of the month, and that was such an encouragement. Thank you. That really helps with what I'm trying to accomplish. I appreciate you, whether you have the ability to support this program or not. Just glad we get to hang out and do this stuff. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.